Recently I posted a video on the Leica Vario-ELMARIT 24-90mm. It's the standard zoom lens in the Leica SL lens system, and it's a fantastic lens. I like it a lot. And in that video I mentioned that I also compared it with the two Apo-Summicron prime lenses in the Leica SL lens system. And the first one here is the 35mm lens, Apo-Summicron widest open aperture f2.0, and the other one is the very famous 50mm Apo-Summicron, also widest aperture is f2.0. And these are fantastic lenses. I've shot a lot of images with these two prime lenses, but from time to time I also like to use my zoom lens here. And if you haven't seen that video on the 24-90mm Vario-ELMARIT, I post the link below in the info box so you can look this up. Now in this video I want to compare the two Apo-Summicrons with the zoom lens from Leica. And these are all standard lenses, so that's the typical focal length you have, 35mm, 50mm. That here is a bit unusual. Typically the standard lens is 24-70mm if it is a standard zoom lens on other camera brands, and here Leica goes up to 90mm, but it comes at a cost because it has a variable aperture, and I'm going to explain this in the course of the video and also demonstrate it in a live shooting what that really means. Here we can always shoot at f2 if we want, but of course we get stuck in a focal length of 35mm and 50mm. In my review of the 24-90mm I outlined 5 reasons why I think this is a fantastic lens, and as I said, look it up if you have not seen it. It really is kind of the best zoom lens I've had in my hand so far, and I think in general, there are sometimes good reasons why you should go for a zoom lens or can go for a zoom lens. Having said that, I'm primarily a prime lens shooter, so I have taken much more images with these two prime lenses on the Leica SL2 than I have taken with the Vario-ELMARIT. But there are situations where it really pays back to have the flex between 24 and 90mm focal length. The comparison will happen in 2 parts. The first part is I will do an in-room shooting and will compare sharpness in the center as well as bokeh of these lenses. And clearly here the Vario-ELMARIT has a disadvantage because of its variable aperture. As said, I'm going to demonstrate this in a moment what it means. And the second part of the video will be a shooting outside under, I would call it, slightly difficult shooting conditions. And I have looked into the images already. All 3 lenses had their challenges to deal with the light and environmental situation we had at this day. But I think it's important to compare also some landscape or city type images, because if you want to look at a lens besides the usual parameters you look at, and I mentioned in that other video that here we have a high reproduction ratio, for instance on 90mm, which makes this lens very well capable for macro shootings and close-ups. But besides the typical parameters you would look into when you want to consider a lens, there are 2 things. Most of the time zoom lenses will be sharp at the center, but they might not be as sharp if you go to the corners. And that's why I also wanted to have a broad landscape, or let's say cityscape picture, in order to see whether we get sharpness corner to corner like we typically have it on these 2 prime Apo-Summicron lenses. Let's get started with the video. As said in the intro, in the first part of the video I'm going for an in-room shooting and will focus on center sharpness and background blurriness. And the model I'm going to use will be a static model, a very famous character from the Netflix TV show The Witcher. And in order to get a little bit of atmosphere around, I also got a background from that TV show on my big TV screen just behind my little model here. And let's get started with the shooting and let's dive right into the topic. I have now mounted the Vario-ELMARIT 24-90mm zoom lens from Leica on my SL2 body here, and I want to quickly show the status screen to show you my settings. I'm in fully manual mode. Aperture I'm going to cover in a moment, exposure time I'm going to cover in a moment. I have an ISO of 100 fixed, no floating ISO. Floating ISO is a setting in the menu of the SL2, which means that the ISO will be automatically increased if you start to increase your focal length on the zoom lens. I have spot metering, I have field focus, autofocus single, self-timer 2 seconds, and of course I'm going for the digital negative and the JPEG here. If I now go back to live view, I want to quickly demonstrate what it means to have a variable aperture zoom lens. And here's my control wheel for the aperture. f2.8 is end of story at 24mm for that lens. That's the widest open aperture I get, but I can stop down, of course, and you see now the aperture value changing. So let's go back to f2.8 and watch now the f-stop, what happens if I turn the zoom ring from 24mm to 35mm. You see how the f-stop is changing? And the camera is doing this automatically because that lens has not a fixed aperture, so I cannot keep it at f2.8 when I zoom in. The more I get my focal length extended, the more the aperture will stop down. So I'm at 3.2 now, and that's the widest open aperture I can get at 35mm. And clearly when we later mount the Apo-Summicron 35mm with an f2, then I can also shoot at f2 and can make the aperture more open, of course. Then I can do this on the zoom lens here. So let's get the exposure time right now, or the shutter speed. And I want to actually focus on the face. And then the light meter here, because I'm on spot metering, is suggesting me to stop down. But then everything gets very dark. And clearly I can recover typically out of the dark information based on the excellent sensor in the Leica SL2, but that's probably not what I want. And f3.2 is still pretty open. If I focus on the more dark parts and then get my shutter speeds lower, it's, I think, possible that the face will not be completely in focus, and I want the face to be in focus. And I can, of course, keep 1/5 of a second. Maybe I control this down to 1/10, or alternatively, we could go to metering and could say, instead of spot metering, we go to center weighted. Let's see what it does on the face. See, I think that's maybe the better part, going for center weighted here. All right, so we have 1/8 of a second, f3.2, ISO 100. Let's go for the shot. 2-second self timer. That's it. Let's quickly check whether the face is in focus. I think that looks pretty nice. And now you see, yes, I think you clearly see it also on the hair, the blue dots from the focus peaking. That looks good. I have everything in the face sharp and in focus. Let's now mount the 35mm lens and let's repeat the experiment with exactly the same settings. So I have now mounted the Apo-Summicron 35mm. We use exactly the same settings, ISO 100, f3.2, 1/8 of a second, and we take the shot with 2-second self timer. Let's quickly check the image. Yes, that looks very good. Everything is sharp and in focus. And now the big advantage of the Apo-Summicrons is that then they can open the aperture up to f2.0. And I'm going to do this now. So I open this up. Of course, it brightens up the image. Now I'm at f2, but if you see what happens if I open the aperture from f3.2 to f2.0, you see that the background gets more blurry. And clearly I can compensate now the brightness by my shutter speed here. Let's say we take the image with 1/20 of a second. That looks good. We still focus on the face, center weighted. And now we have another image, and now the background will be more blurry, and we get a very beautiful background bokeh here. And that's the big advantage of the f2.0 Apo-Summicrons, because 35mm you can only open up to 3.2 on the Vario-Elmarit, whereas on the Apo-Summicron you can open up to f2. Let's quickly do the same experiment now with the 50mm settings, and then let's look into post. Let's now look at 50mm on the Vario-Elmarit, and again I opened the aperture to f2.8, the widest open on 24mm, and watch again the f-stop, what happens if I now zoom in to 50mm. And you see how the lens is stopping down, and now the widest open aperture is an f3.6. Let's get this sharp, and let's go to the face. Perfect. It's actually a nice image. I think if we crop this in, it makes even a nice image of my little model here. So that looks good. Let's quickly look into exposure time. If I want some correction here, maybe to 1.4. I think that looks pretty good. f3.6, 1/4 seconds, ISO 100. Let's take the shot. And let's quickly look into the image. This is very sharp, looks very good. Beautiful model, by the way. Good, let's now mount the Apo-Summicron and then let's look into post. So now we have the 50mm Apo-Summicron on the SL2 and we have a little, let's say, fuzziness here in our experiment, because if you look at the f-stop, I'm now at f4 and the next one is f3.5. So f3.6, like on the variable aperture lens, the Vario-Elmarit, is not possible. I think 3.5 is the closest we can get. Let's keep it at 1/4 of a second here. ISO is still fixed at 100 and let's take the shot. Let's quickly check in the preview. Yes, I think this is super sharp. You see it here, it looks very good. And I think in this way we are done with our settings here, or maybe we should, as we did on the 35mm, now stop down to f2 and check the background blurriness here. So let's go to 1/15 seconds and let's take another shot. And you saw how much the background is changing, and of course the brightness of the image if I open the aperture wider from the 3.5 as an f-stop to f2.0. Let's take that shot also. After 2 seconds we'll have it. Let's quickly check the image. I think that looks good. So here are the two images. I already cropped in here in Capture One to 200% to see the face. And let's quickly go through the metadata. So left hand side is the Vario-Elmarit. As you see here, 24 to 90mm. You see here the shooting parameters, ISO 100, 1/8 seconds, f3.2. Clicking on the right hand side image, that's the Apo-Summicron. Let's quickly confirm that here. Leica Apo-Summicron-SL, 35mm, same shooting parameters, ISO 100, 1/8 seconds, f3.2. So let's do a little experiment at the beginning and let's blur the right hand side, which is our prime Apo-Summicron. And now let's look just at the Vario-Elmarit. And if we look at that image, it's a good image. It's sharp on the eyes, on the eyebrows, on the lips, on the hair. It looks really good. The colors are nice and saturated. I should say I'm only showing images as they came out of the camera in the RAW format. I did not any post manipulation here. And it's a good image. It looks good. But if we take away the blur filter from the right hand side, then there is not much to argue. The Apo-Summicron is sharper, more crisp, has a little more contrast, and you can see this in the eyes, you can see it on the eyebrows, you can see it on the lips and on that black dot in the face of my model, but you also see it in the areas of the hair here and on the clothing of the model, also here. And there is not much to discuss here. The Apo-Summicron is sharper, and you see it when you put them side by side. So let's now quickly put side by side the shot we saw on the left hand side from the Vario-Elmarit, and on the right hand side again the Apo-Summicron, but this time with an aperture of f2. And what you see on the background on my TV screen here with that castle scene is that the background becomes more blurry, of course. And that's the advantage you have on the prime lens with widest open aperture of f2. On the Vario-Elmarit, you get stuck at f3.2, that's the widest open possible aperture at 35mm on that variable aperture zoom lens. And on the prime lens, you can shoot wide open at f2 and get more bokeh, more blurriness in the background, and a slightly more three-dimensional pop in the image. The story continues at the 50mm focal length. The image from the Vario-Elmarit on the left hand side is a very good image. It's sharp, it's crisp, but if you put it side by side with the Apo-Summicron, you clearly see here in the crop into the image that the Apo-Summicron is sharper and more crisp and has slightly more contrast. So also here the prime lens is beating the zoom lens in the way we expected it, but the result from the zoom lens is nevertheless a very good result. Let's now look into the images from the outdoor shooting. As I said at the beginning, I had challenging weather conditions. I was expecting the sun behind me, but I was delayed. And at ETH Terrace in Zurich, we had very humid and hazy weather conditions across the horizon. So I did my work. I made the best I could do with that situation. And clearly the challenge was up for the lenses. So here we see the result. On the left-hand side is again the Vario-Elmarit. On the right-hand side is the Apo-Summicron 35mm. And if we quickly look into the metadata for the image on the left-hand side, you see here we have the lens confirmed in the metadata. You see we have an ISO of 100, 1/250 seconds exposure time, and an aperture of f8. If I click on the right-hand side image, it's exactly the same shooting parameters, and the lens then is the Apo-Summicron-SL 35mm. So let's now go a little deeper in the images here, and let's zoom in. And let's go to 100%, maybe we can afford even 200%, why not? And you see here in the background how hazy the weather was, but I think that was the same, of course, for the prime lenses versus the zoom lens, and they had to deal with it. Now, what I wanted to test here with this outdoor shooting is not the center sharpness. So if I zoom out again, this is exactly the center of the images. What I wanted to see is, besides the center, how the lenses are performing corner to corner. And I think that's something which many people overlook. At the center, zoom lenses are very often sharp. The question is, do they provide corner to corner sharpness? And if we just compare for a moment the center parts of the two images, left-hand side, again, the zoom lens, right-hand side, the prime Apo-Summicron, there is no meaningful difference here. And that's maybe an important lesson to bear in mind. If you shoot not in the studio, like in the first part of the video where I did an indoor shooting, but you shoot outdoor and you have overlays coming from the environment, from the weather, and you know, all these different elements, then very often the differences between super sharp and sharp are not as significant as they might appear if you do the same shooting under studio conditions. And here I do not see any meaningful difference, nothing to note here, but let's scroll around in the image a little bit and let's see what we get here. So far, no differences, I would say. Here, I think I start to see differences. So here is a building which has a restaurant on top. It's a very famous restaurant. It's a club, by the way, so you need to pay for the membership. And here, I think, on the right-hand side, on the Apo-Summicron, we have a bit more sharpness and the image is a bit more crisp. And the same applies to this building here, because here are the letters SIA, and they are a tiny little bit fuzzy, but here they are crisp and tech sharp. And here again, the Apo-Summicron is dominating from a sharpness perspective. But don't forget, I'm at 200% crop here, and if I would go back to 100% crop, then these differences are no longer noticeable, and the images look sharp almost in the same way. Let's go back to 200%. And let's go down a little bit to the lower part of the lens. And here also I would say, if you look at the windows, compare this part with the part on the Apo-Summicron is sharper. I think there is nothing to argue here. But nevertheless, the image at 200% crop on the zoom lens is actually very good. And if you look at the structure on the rooftop here, is also sharp. It's just that if you put them side by side like before, I didn't blur here the right-hand side, the Apo-Summicron is sharper. Period. Let's scroll around a little bit here. Let's have a look into the details. But here I don't see any eye-catching differences. These images from the prime and the zoom lenses are pretty much at par in terms of image quality. Look at this nice little terrace here at 200%. And again, I think the Apo-Summicron is a tiny little bit sharper. But tiny little bit, quote unquote, in the meaning of the word. There is no eye-catching difference here. And I see them better on my computer than you on YouTube. Here's a lot of structure in the image, and we are actually at the border now on the right-hand side of the image. And again, here you have a little bit of softness on the zoom lens, whereas the Apo-Summicron is pinpoint sharp. So here we're looking now at 50mm, left-hand side the Vario-Elmarit, right-hand side the Apo-Summicron. Let's again go into 200% like we did before. Let's adjust this a little bit so we have exactly the same part of the image. And again, at the center, not any difference noticeable. This looks very good. On the zoom lens, I think it's true what I said in my previous video on the Vario-Elmarit 24-90mm. It's one of the best zoom lenses I've ever had in my hands. So let's scroll here a little bit. There is really no difference between these images. It's absolutely amazing, looks good. Let's go back here. Even here now at 50mm, on the CR tower here, you don't see a noticeable difference. That looks good. Also at the rooftop restaurant, looks very good. I don't think there is much to see here. Let's go down. Look at these nice little terraces in Zurich on the rooftops all the time. This is very nice. Here, even on the windows now, this looks good. So I would say at 50mm, I'm at the bottom now, and I'm on the left corner. So left border and the bottom. Here, no difference, looks really good. The sun changed a little bit on these little chimneys here, and that makes the difference. The trees, the leaves on the trees looks very good. Let's go all the way to the right hand side corner. Look at the windows, absolutely at par. Very good. Here is again that tiny little terrace, and I think these images are absolutely the same in terms of quality, if quality means visual impression of sharpness to you. Looks good. Even the colors are very much comparable. Now we come, I guess, to the right hand side border of the image. Yes, so we can only go up here. And I think I'm very much impressed. Also here at the right border, look at the houses here. I think a tiny little bit, if you want, you know, you might argue that the Apo-Summicron is a tiny little bit sharper if you look at that tower here, but not overly, just a tiny little bit, again, in the meaning of the word. These, I think, lenses at 50mm, they are kind of at par. Let's be cautious, let's say almost at par, but there is no noticeable difference in the visual impression of sharpness here. Let's wrap up the video and let's do this quickly. First of all, I'm primarily a prime lens shooter, and it's my workflow, it's what I'm used to, it's what I like, and what you see in the comparisons I did here, not scientific of course, but based on visual impression of what people see in an image, you get a tiny little bit more sharpness, more contrast, more crispiness if you go for the prime lenses Apo-Summicron 35 and 50mm. And it's my workflow, I'm used to it. But I like from time to time to use the Vario-Elmarit 24-90mm because it's a fantastic lens too. And if you remember that little experiment when we blurred out the right hand side, which came from the Apo-Summicron, and looked at the Vario-Elmarit only, the visual impression of that lens is sharpness. Corner to corner is very good, and there's nothing to complain about that lens. Having said that, the Vario-Elmarit is a variable aperture lens, and that means the aperture stops down if you start to zoom. And that imposes restrictions, as we saw in the first part of the video, of course. And if you go for the prime lenses, you can shoot at f2.0 whenever you want, and you can get the background more blurry. And of course, you get more three-dimensional pop into the image if you like that. And that's a restriction you have, of course. Leica is not offering so far a fixed aperture zoom lens with f2.8, or like Canon maybe with even f2.0. But you can use other lenses from the L-mount Alliance, and then you might get what you're looking for. If you like that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. If you like my channel and want to stay tuned on my content, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and peace out.